Legislative Council has come in for a fair bit of stick recently for its very short sittings. Just 21 sittings each year outside of Tynwald, and the relatively passive, if not silent, public face of LegCo members. It's fair to say that MLCs Tanya A, Hanson and Bill Henderson have been stung by recent public criticism of LegCo. Here's what they had to say when I caught up with them last week. LegCo members, alongside Keys members, get paid significant sums of taxpayers' money, but in effect you only meet on 21 days of the year, and for formal LegCo sessions, and an occasional sitting of Tynwald. I think there's other 9 or 10 Tynwald sittings a year. That doesn't seem bad, sort of in terms of the pay compared with the hours that you have to work.
Well, that's an easy thing to say, Phil, and an easy throwaway comment to engender a headline. If you just focus on one chapter of the LegCo book, then yeah, you could point that observation out. But as there is a whole book to look at, I think there's far more in the round than possibly meets the eye or the public are aware of, and that goes both for the Legislative Council and the House of Keys. And of course, the formal sittings that were focused upon to make those observations is giving a bit of a skewed picture, really, because in reality, the amount of work behind each sitting that goes on before we even get to the sitting can be quite phenomenal. And then on top of that, the Tynwald sittings themselves and the preparatory work that goes into that is quite substantial at times. And then on top of that, there's the departmental work if a member wishes to take on departmental duties. And I speak for both the House of Keys and the Legislative Council on that particular matter, because departmental work can be quite onerous, being a political member working with a minister in a government position. And a lot of that work is never seen on the front pages of the Isle of Man media, but in fact it's going on day in and day out. So if a sitting in Legislative Council or House of Keys only lasts a morning, the true fact is that the work is still going on in the background, members are still putting their time in, and certainly for the likes of the House of Keys, they've got an enormous amount of constituency work on top of the legislative work, on top of their departmental work. Legislative Council are a bit less or light on constituency work, obviously, but nonetheless we do get inquiries from the public and have to respond to them and work on various cases or make representations on behalf of island-wide constituents, if I can put it like that. So there's an awful lot of work that's been ignored in some of those comments that we've heard recently, but the reality of it is people have got their nose to the grindstone, and in the most part, in all my years here, I've seen that most members work particularly hard, both in Keys and in LegCo. The comment with regards to the sitting times, I mean, the House of Keys are suffering the same aspect at the minute, or have done, because their legislative time is exactly the same as Legislative Council's legislative time, barring question time, which is more appropriate in the House of Keys because the ministers are present to field the questions. But if you take that out, the House of Keys have had the same amount of legislation as the Legislative Council have. And it's building up in the background at the minute, where there's going to be some very, very busy sessions, same as we saw in the last administration. And the other problem, of course, is with the last administration, the amount of legislation that was worked through. Then comes the problem of introducing the secondary legislation that goes with that to actually energise the bills that were passed, and that's taken a considerable amount of time currently, and it's caused a slowdown in part with the introduction of new bills to the House of Keys and the Legislative Council. So there's catch up to do, but I can see by the end of this administration there will be quite a considerable amount of legislation put through both branches.
And Tanya, I mean, one of the answers that is given when you say, well, there's hardly any legislation going through Keys and obviously then therefore LegCo, people say, well, we shouldn't just be coming up with legislation for the sake of it. But, we've got a housing crisis, we've got a massive problem with public finances at the moment, a whole range of issues, climate change, lots and lots of things that need fixing. So legislation is needed in many cases to sort these problems out.
Yes, it is, but it isn't the only thing. I mean, legislation, and we've got 5 drafters in the Attorney General's chambers, and they are exceptionally good drafters. They're very, 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 well placed to do the job that they're doing. But there is sort of a limit to the amount of work that they can actually get done. Not everything does need legislating for, actually. It takes about 18 months on average from principles of a piece of legislation for, what is this going to look like? What do we want to achieve here? What is sort of the devilment that we're trying to fix? It takes about 18 months on average for a medium-sized bill to make it through government. So it does take a considerable amount of time to draft, to sort of work up the policy, to do that pre-legislative scrutiny work in there, whether that be from officers or be from political members. There is an awful lot of iterative process as well in trying to make sure that we're benchmarking across other jurisdictions, not just the UK, but other jurisdictions, to ensure that what we're creating is exactly right and is exactly right for the Isle of Man. It takes time. But again, you don't need to legislate for everything. I think Mrs. Lord Brennan, the MHK for Glenfaber and Peel, made mention of that in this Tynwald sitting just gone, because we were talking about, sort of a bill that would, a family's bill, basically, that Wales have sort of pulled together, that was in one of the recommendations from the Population Committee. And what she said there was, we can just get on with this stuff, actually. It's policy. Climate change, let's get on with this stuff. It's policy. I think about 60% of the climate change legislation has actually been enacted. Enact the rest of it. There's an awful lot that needs to be done. We know that the back end of the last administration, we had an awful lot of legislation. I mean, I brought through Legislative Council the sexual offences legislation, the domestic abuse legislation. I worked on justice reform, liquor licensing. All of those are huge pieces of legislation that we're now, they're sat with the Minister for Justice and Home Affairs and her department. She's got a certain amount of resource in there. They're plugging away at it. All of the stakeholders are engaged in that. But that's then priority. So, even if you manage to pass all of this legislation and get it through, there are still blockers in terms of, the stakeholders and how busy they are, how they've prioritised their workload and what they've got on. So there's an awful lot more to this whole process than just banging legislation through the branches and getting it out the other side, because once you actually get it out the other side, you've got to implement it.
And yet, a lot of the legislation is largely, how would you put it? I was going to say apolitical. I mean, everything that you do is political in some regard, but a lot of legislative change that is identified as being needed is the same regardless of which form an administration takes. So presumably the previous administration must have had legislative ideas that it didn't have time to fulfill. I've noticed that 2 or 3 of the bills that have gone through in the last year or two are bills that I started work on when I was Environment Minister, and that's back in 2014. So I mean, it's I don't know, what is it about administrations that they have this incredible lack of interest in legislation for the first few years, and then suddenly they try and pile everything at the last minute?
I think that's an easy comment again to make, Phil. It could be classed as a throwaway comment. I don't think it's as straightforward as you make out there. The problem is prioritising what you've got in each of the government departments to start with. And we all know that general elections bring with it a period of uncertainty and settling in as well, where a new cabinet is formed, new departmental memberships have formed. There may well be government staff changes in the throes of that as well. And priorities may actually change. It's not that the legislation's just been thrown in a bin. It's a fact, and other external factors may have come along. And certainly, I know everyone says about COVID and all the rest of it, but that has had a monumental impact across government and on the minute sort of resources the Isle of Man has.
And of course, that's also in relation to COVID. It wasn't just that loads of people were having to work from home and there wasn't the same interaction, but also there was loads of legislation associated with it.
Yeah, there was, and the thing is that any resource available to government, what it was doing at that point in time, it was taken off that, and it was all applied to the COVID crisis, basically, and that does include legislation and so on. And a lot of things were put on the back burner because government needed to cope with the emerging crisis. They didn't have any choice in the matter. It was a huge issue facing our community at the time. And then we have the financial issues that have subsequently occurred with regards to inflation, fuel price hikes, the oil gas market and the supply and demand issues, Ukraine war, and what the Russians have done to the Ukraine or trying to do to the... It's all had a monstrous impact. We're only 85,000 people in a small North Atlantic island at the end of the day. Sometimes we're compared to the huge bureaucratic machinery of Westminster, and we most certainly are not. We try our best and we punch well above our weight at times, but there is a limit to what actually is achievable. And if you try to rush things, especially with legislation and policy, you run straight into the trap of unintended consequences, and you're producing a poorer standard of legislation or a poorer standard of policy, and then you run into the, as I say, the unintended consequences on the other side of that, and that's where the public feels the pinch then, because things haven't been set up quite right, and then they have to be revisited, or representations made to MHKs with regards to certain issues.
You're listening to Agenda with MLCs Tanya August Hanson and Bill Henderson. The other thing with legislation is there's not an awful lot of point in passing legislation if you have no desire or resource to actually implement it properly and enforce it properly.
There is opportunity. I mean, obviously that then needs to be addressed in terms of Treasury and Treasury concurrence to do various different things. But it's, implementation of a piece of legislation, it usually affects, it doesn't just affect one department, it will affect places like registries, it will affect the Attorney General's chambers, because they have all of the secondary drafters in there at the moment who were actually working as policy and legislation people over in departments, and then were moved into the Attorney General's chambers at the start of this administration, and that policy arm was cut away because the AGCs don't do policy. Quite rightly, they don't do policy. So then the expectation is, okay, drafting instructions from the departments, but where are the policy people to do the drafting instructions? So there's all kinds of factors that have kind of been at play, but I agree with what Bill has said. We can't blame everything on COVID. No, we can't 100%, but that COVID period was, yes, we legislated an awful lot. All of that was essentially applied. That all of that resource was COVID legislative.
And of course, the other thing about your role is you're not just here to consider the detail of legislation and then make the case. You also have to do a bit of politicking as well to ensure that you get the support you need.
That's kind of, at the end of the day, Legislative Council, if we're just talking about the very small part of the role that Mr. Henderson was discussing earlier on, it is one chapter in Legislative Council. I mean, the last administration, just using justice reform as an example, but, we suggested things back to the House of Keys, like, improving harassment provisions within the Harassment 2000 Act, and we did exactly that. It's Jane Paul Wilson that moved it in the last administration. The domestic abuse legislation was changed, the ages were altered, and then we ended up with a conference between Keys and Council regarding that. So yes, there is a degree of suggesting back to the House of Keys, because that's what we're here to do. If there is something that's missing, of course we will do that. Regarding politicking, I mean, just as an example, I've got 2 departments. I've got 7 parliamentary committees. I'm on the Comyn Legislative Subcommittee as well. So yes, the Comyn Legislative Subcommittee, by the way, is not a management committee. It is very, very much a, keeping eyes across what is going on. The Attorney General, say, for example, is on that committee alongside ministers. But the rest of it, you've got committees like, say, for example, the chair of the Constitutional, Legal Affairs and Justice Committee. We brought the Youth Justice report through. Those then go into Tynwald. Those policy discussions are happening in Tynwald, that sort of finding the consensus between ourselves and, the government department that we hold to account, or one of, the Department for Home Affairs, and also DHSC were also involved, Health and Social Care. There is a degree of politicking going on there, because you need to find that consensus. You need to take it through Tynwald in the right format, with an update to where each one, on the parliamentary side, the research going on there, and the government side with, what's already been achieved, and matching that up to the best possible benefit moving forward. Yeah, there is politicking that goes on, yes.
And I mean, I recall when I was minister, I think there was only once I ever went to Tynwald knowing that I didn't have enough votes to win. I hadn't already got the vote sorted in advance, if you know what I mean, because you go around and you talk to people and you find out, what do you think about such and such and so and so. And actually that particular vote, I managed to win on a very skullduggerous and sneaky way, because 2 of the members who I knew were going to vote against me hadn't returned to the chamber. So I quickly moved the motion, and we got the vote through, and I won by 1 vote on that occasion. But does that sort of politicking happen? I mean, Bill, you've been around for is it 4, maybe 5 administrations now? Have you noticed any specific changes over recent administrations, or is it pretty much the same as it's always been?
No, is the honest answer to that, Phil. I've been around long enough to see every Chief Minister administration that's been so far, and I started life off in the House of Keys with Sir Miles Walker sitting behind me, so he was the island's first Chief Minister, and subsequent administrations have followed in Sir Miles's footsteps. The changes that I've seen, I could spend hours discussing that, Phil, but there certainly has been many, many changes over the years to both the legislative process, the policy-making process, and one of the key changes that's very important to me, and certainly in my heart, is the way that Tynwald government, current administrations, are more open and more transparent and more willing to sit down and listen to members. And the constant call now is, please come and see me, my door is always open. And with regards to your politicking question there, Phil, I think a large part of a politician's role, whether it be working for government or independently as a Tynwald member, is consultation, negotiation and compromise. And sometimes you have to swallow your pride and look at a compromise, because at the end of the day you're looking what's best for the community, what's best for the Isle of Man. Mightn't be suit you personally or emotionally, but you've got to look at the bigger picture, and it's getting that perspective, and this administration certainly is more open to that. And the days when I came in here first, it was very, very confrontational. We hear new members saying about how confrontational it can be now, but by golly, it is nothing compared to when I entered politics first. And if you look at Westminster, I mean, this is a kindergarten here compared to some of the spats that we see in Westminster Parliament, and certainly if you were facing an adversary such as Angela Rayner, you wouldn't know what hit you half the time. And she's very able, a very able politician who can stick up for herself and her party and deliver a very powerful message. But I don't think that's quite suitable for our Tynwald, but the way we do business here also is exceptionally well tempered as well, Phil, and I think we get more done as a result of that. But the changes overall have been quite phenomenal, subtle in places, but we've developed to a position now where I feel we're far more open, less confrontational than when I first came in, due to the change of administrations, changes of attitudes especially, and ministers and chief ministers, especially the current chief minister. I'm quite impressed with his way that he relates to backbenchers especially. People aren't dismissed and put down. People are actually listened to or actually invited into his office and talk to me about this, give me your views, give me the evidence, let's have a think about this, where can we go with a compromise?
One of the roles that LegCo does have, and sadly we are coming to the end of the programme now, is holding Keys back a bit and saying, hang on, are you sure about this? There were a number of examples of that in Tynwald this month.
Potentially, actually, with the I don't think that the conversation's really over with the bishop's vote and position in Tynwald. I think likely that's going to sort of crop back up again from a number of backbenchers. I think that sometimes Legislative Council, whether it be actually in the Legislative Council chamber legislating or being in Tynwald Court, I think sort of the only power that we've really got is delay. We don't really have any other power. That it doesn't exist.
And on the bishop thing, there was
very important.
Yeah, but there was support in Keys to remove the bishop's vote, I think, wasn't there? But not removing the bishop.
Because there were 8 members of Keys, I think, that voted for it. The way that it sort of worked, so we had the amendment from the Speaker of the House of Keys, which amended Mrs. Maltby's amendment to Joni Farragher's motion. I think that with Mr. Speaker's amendment, Mrs. Maltby's motion would have made perfect sense, which is exactly what was said in the chamber. And once that was lost, you ended up with Mrs. Maltby's motion. Mrs. Maltby's motion, I think, was 14-4 in the House of Keys, and then LegCo voted against. LegCo voted against because Mr. Speaker's amendment had gone. So it made even less sense to then vote for it. So that's precisely what happened there. And then obviously once that was lost, it went to vote on whether or not we should get rid of the bishop from Tynwald and from Legislative Council. And then only 8 people actually voted for that. So we need to be a little bit more, I think, to say that the House of Keys voted for Mrs. Maltby's amendment and Legislative Council voted against Mrs. Maltby's amendment is slightly disingenuous without including Mr. Speaker's amendment was lost, and that's the reason why.
And Bill, very, very briefly, sadly, because we've only got a few seconds left, really.
There was a little bit of confusion as well with the amendments, because some backbenchers thought if you voted for the amendment, it would be a great compromise. But in fact, if the amendments were successful, it would still put us back to the point where we have the Archbishop of York's letter on the table saying if the bishop loses his vote, basically the island will lose the bishop and the bishopric. Well,
are you convinced? Was LegCo blocking of Keys' desire to remove the bishop's vote the right thing to do? Is LegCo a vibrant scrutinising tool essential to our future, or is it a rather outdated establishment very much in need of reform? Does government have far more important stuff to be getting on with than creating new law, or is new law essential to fixing the problems we face? Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now, though, I'm Phil Gaughan. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.